Good day, everyone. The topic for this video is exploring whether gender equality is actually a viable goal or solution to the problems between men and women today and into the future, even after this feminist society that we currently have either collapses or somehow transitions into something else. What is the sort of long-term prognosis of what a lot of people call real or true gender equality? So I'm not sure that a pure sense of gender equality is actually a viable goal for the future, even after this current society that we're in either collapses or somehow transitions into something else in the distant future, whatever that may look like. I think most likely it's going to implode in on itself, but whatever form that takes exactly, what sort of viability remains with true or actual gender equality, as many of the people that oppose feminism and the current system and the current state of affairs between men and women, as those things are now, a lot of people will say, well, I support real gender equality instead of feminism. And that really makes me think about things, because I don't know that we can really do a whole lot better with gender equality as the sort of underlying theme or goal. The problem is that men and women are so different from one another that equality in any practical sense tends to make everyone miserable, or it tends to be exploited in such a way that some people are more equal than others. And usually that seems to take the form of what we have now with feminism and gynocentrism, which is, well, women are more equal than men. It's equality as it benefits women at men's expense, but when you actually look at other factors like homelessness or the suicide rate or having access to your kids taken away, we don't want equality with that, right? It's only equality as it benefits women. But I think that, honestly, even if we would have a pure sense of equality as the goal, I don't think women would want that in particular. I think a lot of men would be miserable with that as well, but women especially, I think, would not really want that. And you can look at various things like reproductive rights. If we actually had equal reproductive rights as a goal, do you honestly think that women would be okay with men having the right to paternal surrender across the board as long as women had the right to abortion of convenience? Or would women, for the most part, want to throw a fit if that were the actual standard and potentially just do away with abortion of convenience if that's what it took to actually keep men with the requirement to basically take care of their provider and protector role over that child that would potentially be born in that type of situation? It's hard to say exactly what everything would look like, but I think that if you actually tried to pursue real or true gender equality, it would mostly benefit women still. But even if you could get beyond that, most women don't really want to meet the male standard. You can see the same thing in the workplace. You can see the same thing with dating, where women still expect men to pay for dinners or to be the one that approaches them before they even go out on a date. Most of the time, women, if they're forced to actually encounter true equality, they don't want it. When it comes to having to defend yourself against a wild animal, we've seen cases like that where it's like, where are all the men not protecting the women? Well, no one's going to protect you as a guy. Isn't that gender equality? Most women are very dissatisfied when real gender equality is actually brought to bear. And so while I agree that men and women are equally human, in that basic sense, we deserve human rights, so to speak, any application beyond being equally human will tend to be as useless as saying that apples and oranges are equal because they both happen to be fruit, and one isn't any more fruit than the other, so therefore apples and oranges need to be treated the same. They're not the same. If you have orange pie, it's probably going to taste like crap. That's just the reality of what we're trying to do with the genders today, even when we have this idea in mind of true gender equality. It turns out bad because men and women are so different from one another, and what men want and what women want out of life is so foreign to the other gender that it really doesn't benefit anybody. in the long run even. I don't think that there is any sort of way to make men and women be happy treated the same way or at the same level in a lot of cases. Especially, again, for women. Women tend to want special treatment from men, but at the same time, a lot of guys would not really be happy trying to just take care of the home. And some guys are okay with that, and men can adapt a lot better than women, but most men would not really want to be treated like women either. They would find a lot of the things that women do to be not really worthwhile, superficial. The whole social atmosphere that men like versus women is so different. Whatever the element, whatever the variable that you want to look at, men and women are so different from one another that equality beyond being equally human becomes like saying, well, a banana and an apple are equal to one another because they're both fruit, so got to treat them the same way, got to put them in the same sort of dishes. That would not make sense just because they both happen to be fruit. And I think treating men and women the same way because they're equally human is very similar to the results that you get with that. It's not something that actually makes either men or women happy in the long run. So in practice, men and women differ to such a degree that we function like subspecies in many cases. And so trying to enforce a doctrine of real equality is likely to either only serve one gender's interests over the other, like I've described, where women are more equal than men, or no one's long-term interests at all are going to be actually taken into account. Men are going to be miserable, women are going to be miserable. Again, men can find a way to adapt by just not investing in society, for example. You can look at the things that actually are going on now with the feminist version of gender equality that is more clearly just one-sided in favor of women in very obvious ways once you figure it out and once you actually start to think for yourself. But even if we had more of an effort toward pure gender equality, I don't think that men or women would be satisfied with that. And the only reason that women, especially your feminist women and even your feminist men, will say that they support gender equality is because they actually are using that as code for we want to pander to women. We want to give more stuff to women. But in reality, if you actually pursued pure gender equality, both men and women would be unhappy. I don't think that that's something that's really going to satisfy anyone unless it's used as a political tool or basically a weapon that one gender uses against the other, like we see with feminism as it is today. So instead of equality as a long-term goal, I think it makes much more sense to consider equity in the original intended sense, not the modern leftist politics type of sense that we see today where equity means equal outcomes. That's not what I'm talking about here. I mean equity in the sense of we actually look at what men want from women and what women want from men, and we actually try to facilitate that. That's the only thing that I think actually makes any sense. And I'm not talking about going back to traditionalism per se, for anybody that wants to say that that's the intended goal or that's the message that I'm trying to give here. It's not really about going back to traditionalism, although I think that traditionalism worked better in many ways than what we have now. Traditionalism at least tried to take men and women's needs into account and said, hey, you as a man are going to be a provider and protector, but you have most of the authority over your family. I do think that ultimately that element will be reestablished at some point because society is going to require men to be providers basically forever. I don't know of a good way around that because the idea behind gender equality is that if you just give women the chance or you basically make them step up and do the same things as men, that they will. And I remember many years ago, TFM used to talk about how you have these shows, they're reality TV shows, so you can question how much of what you see is actually what's happening, but they would split different competitions up into men versus women. And what would happen is the men would build their shelter, especially if it was a survivalist type of show. They would build their shelter, they would have a source of water, they would be getting food from the river with fish or finding small game or something like that. And the women would flounder around and they wouldn't do anything and they wouldn't build a shelter, they wouldn't have clean drinking water. What ends up happening repeatedly and predictably is women will go to men and say, hey, can you help us out? Can you do this for us? And I'm not trying to say that, for example, I know how to build a proper shelter or whatnot, but men know how to work together. The men that have certain knowledge can teach other men. They can basically put their feelings to the side and accept that something's going to be difficult and just go do it. Women, by and large, are never going to step up and do that. And that's another problem with the idea of gender equality, is how do you really establish that what women do is equal with what men do? That's the problem with the actual results of the wage gap, is that what men do tends to be pretty necessary, at least in some cases, whereas what women do is more optional. And so you have to work with gender equality on that basis too, is just sort of not really having, in my opinion, any sort of ability to be realized because what men do is so pivotal. And so I think you're going to have to recognize, if you're going to fix things between men and women, that if men are going to be expected to be the providers and protectors, they need to have most of the authority in the home. And you can look at hypergamy as well. Women don't even want to date men that make less money than them. So how do you work around that with actual or pure gender equality? Women are not going to be satisfied dating men at or below their level. So again, if men are expected to do more, then I think that the solution to that is going to be that they get the majority of the authority in the home. The woman gets a say, but at the same time, the man has most of the authority and pretty much the final word, as long as he's not being abusive, as long as he's not doing something that is insane, basically, then the man should have most of the authority in the home. I think that that's the solution. But if you think, well, we just need to pursue gender equality and work on our problems as men and women together and be supportive, and a lot of the stuff that you see even from your traditional conservative and anti-feminist spokespeople, it's just, how are you going to do that if women are still hypergamous? How are you going to do that if men are ultimately going to be the providers and protectors anyway within society and within the family structure? So that's another huge issue with this, is in a lot of ways men and women just aren't equal. And it's not a matter of saying men are superior across the board, but the things that women could do, they don't want to do anymore, largely. They don't want to take care of the kids. They don't want to take care of the home for a man. So they lose their value through that process. But before I digress any more into that, I want to stick with the main topic here, which is, again, I think instead of equality, it makes more sense to consider actual equitable arrangements or fairness, and encouraging men and women to actually meet each other's needs and to actually basically give some sort of benefit to the person that they're in a relationship with, or to the person that they could potentially have a family with. There's got to be mutual benefit. There's got to be, what is it that men want? What is it that women want? And how can we actually facilitate men and women giving that to each other in a positive way? Usually, it takes the form, just in a basic sense, of the woman gives her exclusive intimacy to the man, sex, companionship, support to the man, and the man basically makes sure that the woman has enough provision and protection to get by. Again, I want to stress that I'm not saying traditionalism in a pure sense is what we should go back to in order to make that work, but gender equality is not going to make that work. Trying to shift to true or pure equality between men and women is not going to address what men and women actually want from one another. So I honestly think, guys, that without abandoning the idea of across-the-board equality as a goal between men and women, I'm not sure any progress will ever be made at improving relations between the genders, even after the current system is no longer in place. Even if feminism would go away, I don't think that this idea of pursuing true gender equality is going to go anywhere, other than sort of what we have now, where it's equality as it benefits women, although theoretically it could be equality as it benefits men as well, but I don't see that happening. History is not replete with examples of androcentrism compared to gynocentrism. And so I think that women are going to be the ones that benefit from this supposed equality in many cases. But even if you could get beyond that and say, no, there's going to be across-the-board equality. If women have the right to abortion of convenience, that's only if men have the right to paternal surrender. If there's domestic violence in a situation, the woman can go to jail too. If basically there's gender expectations on one side, then men are allowed to expect things of women again in terms of gender roles. Even if you could do all that, I don't think anybody would be happy. I think both men and women would be miserable, and women especially, because then they're going to have to step up and be providers and protectors. And even now you see these girls on TikTok talking about how they hate the 9-to-5 work life, how they hate basically having to provide for themselves, how they hate not just having a man to take care of them. And this is something that has increased in prevalence over time. You see more and more of these sort of clips. And it's because women are not really going to be satisfied with living the male life. If you're a guy, you don't want to be stuck in those kinds of jobs either, but you can handle it pretty much, at least for a long period of time. Whereas women are not really built to do this. There are too many differences in these kinds of manners between men and women for women to be satisfied, truly being expected to meet the male standard. And men really in the long run are not going to be happy not being allowed to have kids that are actually theirs, that can't just be taken away from them, right? Men are not happy overall about the system that we live in. As individuals, we can find happiness, we can adapt, but men are not happy with the current arrangement being the way that it is, being so set against them in many cases, to where you really can't have a family in the conventional manner. Most men are not really satisfied with that. We wish that things were better, in other words. But even in a case where you're trying to pursue real or pure gender equality, I'm not sure that that improves much. I'm not sure men would be happy with that, and I'm sure women would not be happy with actually being expected to be like men or to meet the same standard as men. And so the point of me making this video, guys, to sort of wrap this up, is to say that because men and women operate so differently when it comes to their functioning and well-being and their personal goals, I'm not sure that the idea of overall gender equality has a useful application besides, as I've said, serving one gender's interests over the other or making everyone miserable. And I think this is a good sign when you see a lot of the anti-feminist rhetoric and a lot of the, even within the men's community, a lot of the people that want to say, I support real gender equality, or those that are on the right politically, that are traditional conservative or have some other brand of conservative ideology that they generally subscribe to. If they're saying, oh, I support real gender equality instead of what we have now, I get that. I get that that's an improvement compared to supporting feminism. But at the same time, I think that's a good sign that things are not going to get better. Because I don't think there is going to be any pursuit of real or true gender equality. I think instead what we really need to do, if we're ever going to have a social contract between men and women again in this society or in a future society, I think what we have to do is just say, all right, what do men want? What do women want? Men want exclusive access to intimacy, to know that their kids are actually theirs, that they can raise. As long as they're not actually abusive to their family, it's going to be their family. And women want the guy to basically take care of the family. They want the guy to be the provider and protector. And if men and women are going to get together and give each other what they tend to want, then the man has to be secure in that situation if he's going to invest a good deal of his life into having a family on that basis. The opposite of what we have now, basically, where it can be taken from you at any time just because the woman decides she's not happy. And so I think that as long as we have this situation where much of the anti-feminist rhetoric is, I support real equality between men and women, I actually think that's a sign that nothing good is going to happen. I know that's sort of a pessimistic outlook or conclusion to draw, but I don't think that's the solution. I think the solution is, what do we really want from each other? We need to abandon the idea of gender equality beyond acknowledging that men and women are equally human. We need to abandon the idea of making men and women equal in any practical sense, the same way that you wouldn't try to make an apple and a banana equal in any practical sense. You're not going to make a banana pie. I guess you can, but you're not going to make apple marmalade. You're going to make orange marmalade, right? Different fruits, even though they're equally fruit, are good for different things. I know that that's a silly analogy, but that in a straightforward way is the way that I see men and women. We're so different from each other that gender equality is either going to serve one gender's interests over the other, probably women's interests over men's interests, or it's just going to make everyone miserable. And until we abandon that and actually look at what men and women tend to want from one another. And I understand you have individual outliers. I understand that there are men that are wired to think more like women and women that are wired to think more like men. And of course you have people that aren't straight, right, that are LGBT or whatever. I don't care about any of that for the purposes of this video or the content that I'm making here, really. What I'm saying is, those outliers aside, men and women generally want these things from each other. They're not based on equality. They're not based on trying to make men and women equal across the board. They're based on men and women basically being able to add something positive to the lives of the people that they date or they have relationships with or potentially marry. It's a matter of actual mutual benefit and actually being able to have a stake in the game in a positive way. And unless we can abandon the idea of pure gender equality as the goal, I don't think there's any chance of reaching that. It's similar to how if you don't get rid of no-fault divorce, there really is no hope of fixing the marriage system. If you don't get rid of this idea of long-term gender equality in favor of actually looking at what men and women can do for one another, then I don't think you're ever going to fix things between men and women in this situation. And that's another sign that things are just not going to get better, honestly.